The security footage showed it happening at 4:17 p.m. on a Wednesday in March. A woman in a blue house uniform had placed herself between a child and a locked bedroom door. The child was 7 years old and crying without sound, the kind of crying that happens after a person has learned that making noise brings worse things than staying quiet. The woman in the uniform was not moving. She stood with her back to the door and her arms slightly out at her sides, and the woman on the other side of the corridor, silk blouse, bare feet, a glass of something clear in her left hand, was speaking to her in a voice that did not carry on the recording, but whose effect was visible in the way the maid's jaw tightened and did not release. The maid did not move away from the door. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. At the end of it, the woman in the silk blouse walked back down the corridor, and the maid reached behind her and unlocked the door, and the child came out and pressed her face against the woman's stomach, and the maid put both arms around her and stood there, not moving, until the child's breathing slowed. Adese Nwosu did not know the camera was there. She had been working in the house on Bordillion Road in Lagos for 3 years and 4 months. She was 44 years old and had arrived weighing 58 kilograms, which had gone down to 53 in the first year because the household ran on a rigid structure that gave staff 1 meal during an 8-hour shift and nothing else. And 53 kilograms on a frame of 5 feet 4 inches was a number that showed in the face before it showed anywhere else. By the second year she had adjusted, she kept groundnuts in her pocket and learned which mornings the kitchen was unsupervised. She had come from Onitsha, where she had worked for 11 years at a provisions shop owned by her cousin before the shop closed, and the cousin moved to Port Harcourt, and the network she had built her life on folded overnight. She had 2 children of her own, a son named Tobena, who was 19 and studying engineering at a polytechnic in Benin City, and a daughter named Chidinma, who was 16 and living with Adese's elder sister in Enugu, and who called her mother every Sunday at 8 p.m. without exception and without being asked. She had been hired through a domestic staffing agency on Victoria Island. The contract specified a 6-day week, accommodation in the staff quarters at the back of the property, a monthly salary of 85,000 naira, and a probationary period of 90 days. She had never been offered the salary increase that the contract stipulated at the end of 12 months of satisfactory employment. She had not raised it, because raising it would have required a conversation with the woman of the house, and that was not a conversation that went well in that house for the people who initiated it. The woman of the house was named Ifeoma Bankole Martins. She was 36 years old and had married Emeka Bankole Martins 4 years ago in a ceremony that had cost 22 million naira and been photographed for a society magazine whose cover she kept framed in the second sitting room. She was beautiful in the way that requires significant maintenance, early mornings, appointments, a schedule that Adese had memorized because it governed the texture of each day. She was also, by 4 p.m. most days, on her second glass of whatever she had started at noon, and the quality of the afternoon depended on which version of herself the second glass produced. The child was named Adana. She was 7 years old and had her father's eyes, which were very large and very steady, and her mother's mouth, which was precise and small. She had been born from Emeka Bankole Martins's first marriage, which had ended when Adana was 3 years old, and whose details lived in the house the way old smoke lives in a room. You could not see it, but you could not mistake it for fresh air either. Adana's mother had died of a cardiac event 18 months after the divorce, which Adese had learned not from anyone in the household but from Adana herself, who had mentioned it once while they were peeling yam together in the kitchen, in the matter-of-fact way that children report facts that have been sitting inside them long enough to stop hurting on the outside. Adese had been peeling yam and listening, and had said, quietly, that she was very sorry. Adana had said her mother had very long hair and that she used to smell like the inside of a new handbag, which was her favorite smell. Then, she had picked up the next piece of yam, and they had continued. That had been 2 years and 3 months ago. Since then, Adeze had become the architecture of Adana's day. Not her mother, she was clear about that distinction, internally, and she respected it the way you respect a boundary that is both real and necessary. But she was the one who packed the school bag on the mornings when Adana moved slowly, because something was wrong and she didn't have the language for it yet. She was the one who knew that Adana disliked the texture of boiled plantain, but would eat it if it was fried until the edges went dark. She was the one who had noticed, 6 months ago, that Adana had started waking before 6 a.m. and sitting in the kitchen doorway with her knees pulled up and her eyes on the middle distance, and who had started coming down early on those mornings to put the kettle on and not say anything about it, so that the child was not alone in whatever she was sitting with. The Wednesday in March was not the first incident. It was the 4th in 11 weeks. Adeze had not written any of them down, because writing them down felt like constructing an accusation, and constructing an accusation was not something she had been hired to do. She had simply interposed herself each time, stood in the gap between the child and the thing coming toward the child, and absorbed what was redirected at her. She had absorbed a great deal. After the camera incident, she still did not know about the camera. Ifeoma Bunkole Martins had called her to the sitting room and explained in a controlled voice that staff who did not understand their role in this house were staff who did not remain in this house. Adeze had stood with her hands at her sides and said, "Yes, madam." She had gone back to the kitchen and finished preparing dinner. She had served it at the correct time and cleared the table and washed the dishes and gone to the staff quarters and called Kedinma at 8 p.m. and listened to her daughter talk for 22 minutes about a teacher who had said something encouraging about her biology exam, and she had made the appropriate sounds of agreement and pride, and after the call she had sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the staff quarters for a while, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. She had been doing the math for 7 weeks. She had 41,500 naira saved in a bank account she accessed on her monthly day off. She needed 95,000 naira for Tabena's next semester fees, which were due in 6 weeks. The gap was 53,500 naira, and she was not going to close it before the deadline from savings alone. And she had been turning this over in her mind at intervals the way you turn a problem over when you know the shape of it, but cannot yet find the entry point. She had not considered leaving. Not because the math was comfortable. It was not. But because leaving required knowing that Adana would be all right, and she did not know that. And she had decided some time ago that not knowing that was not something she could carry and still sleep. She had tried 3 times to find the correct channel for what she was observing. She had spoken once to the housekeeper who came on Fridays, an older woman named Constance, who had worked on Bourdion Road longer than Adeze had been alive. Constance had listened to everything Adeze said, and then had been quiet for a moment, and then had said, "Document what you see. Keep it somewhere he cannot find it." She had not explained who he was or what the documentation was for, but Adeze had understood the shape of the advice even without the details. She had begun keeping a small notebook in her uniform pocket, writing down dates and times, and what she had observed, in the shorthand she had developed for the provisions shop inventory, precise and compressed. She had not used the notebook yet. The right moment for using it had not arrived, and then Emeka came home 36 hours early. And the right moment arrived not from her hands, but from a camera she had never known was there. If this story is already sitting heavy with you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what Emeka Bonkole Martins does when he sees that footage changes the entire shape of this story. Emeka Bonkole Martins had been in Abuja for 9 days when he came home early. He was 49 years old, broad-shouldered, and moved through rooms with the particular efficiency of a man who had made a great deal of money by making faster decisions than other people. He ran 3 companies across Lagos and Abuja, and the Abuja trip had ended 36 hours ahead of schedule because a deal he had been expecting to take 4 days of negotiation had collapsed in 2. He had taken the 6 a.m. flight back, landed at Murtala Mohammed Airport at 8:14 a.m., and been in the car home by 8:45. He had not called ahead. This was not unusual. The house was his house, and it had not previously occurred to him to announce his arrival to it. He found Adana in the kitchen at 8:45, eating bread and groundnut paste, sitting on the kitchen stool the way she sat on kitchen stools, elbows on the counter, feet hooked on the lower rung, the particular hunched posture of a child who has decided the kitchen is the safe part of the house. She looked up when he came in, and something happened in her face that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but contained elements of both. He sat down on the stool beside her. He asked her how school was. She told him. She asked him how Abuja was. He said it was fine. He asked her if she had seen his good blue tie, which he was almost certain he had left in the bedroom. She said she didn't think so, but she could check his second wardrobe. He said he would check himself, and he ruffled her hair, which she allowed, and then smoothed back down with one hand in the practiced way of a child who accepts affection but requires order to resume immediately after. He found the tie. He found other things. He found that the small table in Adana's room, which had been pushed against the wall beside her wardrobe, had 2 of its 4 corners dented in a way that suggested it had been knocked hard and more than once. He found that the bookshelf had been rearranged in a way Adana had not mentioned, and he knew she hadn't mentioned it because Adana organized her books by emotional category, a system she had explained to him at length when she was 5, sitting on the floor with the books spread in a circle around her, sorting them with the seriousness of a scholar. And the system was gone, replaced by size. He found that Adana's school journal, which should have been in the drawer of the small table, was in the wardrobe behind 3 folded sweaters, and that 3 of the pages inside had been torn out unevenly, the way pages are torn when somebody grabs them and pulls. He stood with the journal open in his hands in his daughter's room and looked at the torn edges, and at the room, and at the corner of the small table. The room smelled of the lavender spray that Adeze used on the sheets on Wednesdays. The curtains were yellow, which Adana had chosen herself. There was a drawing on the wall, taped up at the corner because the blue tack had dried out, of a woman with very long hair standing next to a small girl. Adana had drawn it 2 years ago and had told him it was from a dream. He sat down in the small chair by Adana's window and looked at the journal for a while. Then he went to the security system panel in the study. He had not looked at the household footage in 4 months, because in 4 months there had been no occasion to, or so he had believed. He began watching from the 1st of January. It took him 2 hours and 40 minutes to watch what he needed to watch. He watched it with the volume low and did not stop it, except twice. Once to sit back in the chair and press both hands flat against his face and stay like that for a while, and once to forward over a section he had understood from the first 3 seconds and did not need to understand more completely. When he had finished, he sat in the study for 11 minutes without doing anything at all. Then he called his lawyer at 10:52 a.m. Then he went looking for Adeze. She was in the utility room, ironing. The utility room was at the back of the house near the staff quarters, long and narrow, with a single high window that let in a strip of morning light. She was ironing a school shirt of Adana's, the white one with the collar that needed particular care at the pleat, and she did not immediately hear him come in because the iron made a soft hiss when it moved. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up. Her face arranged itself into the careful neutral that staff in that house had learned to wear when a member of the family entered a room. The expression that gave nothing away, because giving nothing away was the safest policy. He said, "Can you sit down for a moment?" It was not a question. But it was not the kind of not a question she had learned to be careful of. She set the iron on its heel and sat in the plastic chair against the wall. He sat on the edge of the worktop across from her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor between them. "I watched the footage," he said. She said nothing. "All of it," he said. "From January." She looked at him. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before in 3 years. Not anger, something that had no quick name. Something that was anger adjacent, but also had the quality of a man looking at something he had failed to look at in time. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. She looked at the ironing board. She looked back at him. "I am the maid, sir." He looked at her steadily. "That's not an answer." "It is the only answer I have," she said. A silence sat between them that had weight to it. The iron cooled on its heel. The strip of light from the high window moved slightly as something passed outside. "She calls you every Sunday," he said. "Your daughter." Adeze looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. "I know more about this household than you may think," he said. "I have simply not been here enough to act on what I know." He said this without looking away from her, as though it were important to him that she understood he was not offering an excuse. He told her he was going to handle things. She waited to hear what handling things meant, because in her experience the phrase covered a very wide range of outcomes, not all of them good. He told her he had engaged a lawyer that morning, and that Ifeoma would be leaving the house by the end of the week. He told her this was not a decision made because of what he had seen on the footage, but that what he had seen on the footage had removed the last uncertainty about a decision he had been forming for 3 months. He said this carefully, as a man says something when he wants the distinction to be clear. Then he said, "What you did for my daughter, standing at that door, she told me about it. She told me 6 weeks ago, and I flew back to Abuja the next morning, and I did not call anyone or change anything, and that is something I will have to sit with." Adeze said nothing. "What are you owed?" he said. She looked at him. "Sir, your contract. You were due an increase at 12 months. You are now at 40 months. What are you owed?" It was the second time she had been asked a direct question about money, and the word felt unfamiliar in her mouth. She named the figure, the increase, compounded across 28 months, because he had asked her directly, and she was not a woman who lied about numbers. The figure was 910,000 naira. He nodded once. He told her it would be in her account within 48 hours, in full, with an additional amount to cover the polytechnic fees through the end of Tobena's program, which he had looked up before he came to the utility room. He had looked up the fees. This was the detail that told her, before any of the larger things, that the conversation was real. She pressed both hands flat against her thighs and looked at the space between her shoes and said, "Thank you, sir," he said. "No." He said it quietly, without drama, in the way that a man says a word when he means it to do heavy lifting. "Thank you." He left the doorway. She heard him cross the yard toward the main house. She sat in the plastic chair for a while, without moving, her hands still pressed flat against her thighs, looking at the Adana's ironed school shirt on the board. She was still sitting like that when Adana appeared in the doorway of the utility room. The child had her school bag over one shoulder even though it was a Wednesday and school had already happened and was over. She was wearing it the way she sometimes wore it in the afternoon, not going anywhere, just carrying it. "Daddy is talking to Mama," she said. "I know," Adaisy said. Adana looked at her. "Are you going somewhere?" Adaisy looked at her steadily. "No." Adana came into the utility room and sat down on the floor beside the chair. Not in a chair of her own, just on the floor, cross-legged, the school bag still on, and picked up a piece of cloth from the basket of things waiting to be ironed and began folding it into a small square. She was not good at folding yet. The square was not quite a square. She folded it anyway. Adaise watched her do it and did not correct the square. Ifioma Bankole Martins left the house on Bourdion Road 5 days later, on a Monday morning, in a car driven by her elder brother, who had come from Port Harcourt at her request. She took 3 suitcases and the framed photograph from the second sitting room. She did not say goodbye to Adana. She did not say goodbye to Adaise. She said something to the driver as they pulled out of the gate that nobody else heard. The house changed its texture within 24 hours. It was difficult to name precisely how, because the change was not loud and was not marked by any single moment. It was more that certain silences disappeared. The kind that live in a house when the rooms are being monitored, and the silences that replaced them were the kind that simply exist in a house where people are living, ordinary and unguarded. Adana woke up the following Saturday at 7:30 a.m. and came to the kitchen and sat on her stool and asked if they could make chin-chin. She specified that she wanted the kind with the twisted shape, not the cut squares, and that she wanted it sweet rather than savory, and that she thought they should use nutmeg this time, because she had read somewhere that nutmeg was traditional. She did not specify where she had read this. Adaise did not ask. She got out the flour and the egg, and Adana got out the bowl without being asked, climbing on the step stool to reach the second shelf where the large mixing bowls lived, and they made chin-chin for 2 hours. The dough took 3 attempts to get right because Adana's measurements were enthusiastic rather than precise, and each attempt produced a slightly different texture. And by the third they had agreed on a consistency that was firm enough to twist without cracking. The kitchen smelled of flour and frying oil, and the faint sweetness of nutmeg, and the morning light came through the east window in a long stripe that moved across the floor as the hours passed. During those 2 hours, Adana talked continuously about topics that ranged from the biology of butterflies. She had decided butterflies could probably see colors that humans couldn't, and wanted to know if there was a word for that, to a song she had heard on the radio, to a hypothesis she had formed about why the family dog, a large brown animal named Chokwe Mecca, whom Adana called Emeka for short, always slept with his chin on her father's shoes. The hypothesis involved loyalty and smell, and a theory about shoe leather that Adaise could not entirely follow, but which had internal logic she respected. Adaise listened and replied and turned the dough, and did not point out that Adana's hands were too small to knead it properly, just guided them when necessary. And they worked together while Emeka the dog slept under the table with his chin on a shoe that had been left near the kitchen door, confirming the hypothesis entirely. That Sunday, Shadinma called at 8 p.m. As always, Adaise took the call in the yard. She told her daughter that things were stable. She told her the fees were covered. Chidinma said, genuinely, and her mother heard the genuine in it. Mama. How? Adaise said she would explain on her next day off. She heard her daughter exhale the way you exhale when a weight you have been carrying lifts, not completely, but enough. After the call, she stayed in the yard for a while. The Lagos night was thick and warm and smelled of rain that had fallen earlier and the soil that had received it. She could hear the television from the main house, something Adana was watching that had a great deal of music in it. She could hear Emeka moving around inside near the kitchen door. She thought about Onacha. She thought about the provisions shop, and her cousin, and the 11 years she had built, and the night the structure of it folded. She had come from that night to this yard, and the distance between them was not measurable in kilometers or years, but in the particular kind of stamina that doesn't have a better word than endurance, except that endurance sounds passive, and what she had done was not passive. She had positioned herself, repeatedly, between harm and a child who was not hers, and it held the position. And the position had held. Tobena called her the following Tuesday at lunchtime, which was unusual. He said the fee payment had gone through, and that he checked 3 times to be sure. He asked her what had happened. She said a good man had done the right thing. Tobena said he was going to work hard enough to make it worth it. She said she knew that. She said she had always known that. There is a thing that people do to the ones they employ in their homes, something so commonplace that it passes without anyone naming it. They stop seeing them. Not with malice, for the most part, just with the habitual blindness that settles over a person when another person is always present and always useful and never requires anything back. The maid becomes part of the architecture. She is expected to absorb and not to carry, to give and not to need, to stand in whatever gap opens and stand there quietly and cost nothing. What she carries anyway, her children's names, her own history, the small, careful math of survival, the knowledge of what a child sounds like when they have learned not to cry out, none of this is erased by being unseen. It is still there. It continues, and sometimes, when a man comes home 36 hours early and sits in a study for 2 hours and 40 minutes watching a screen, and then goes looking in a utility room for the woman who did what he could not, the unseen thing becomes visible. What is visible cannot be unfiled. What a person holds cannot be taken from the holding. You can give someone 85,000 naira a month and call it payment. You can call her the maid. You can walk past the utility room 17 times without stopping. But the quality of what she does when the door is closed and there is only the child and the corridor and the thing coming down it, that is not something you purchased. That is something she brought with her. It was always hers. Leave your answer in the comments if you were Emeka, sitting in that study watching those 4 minutes and 11 seconds of footage, knowing you had been in Abuja for 9 days and had not called ahead. What is the first thing you do when the video ends? Not the lawyer. Not the decision. The first thing. I want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.